We are each a violin, and we have to allow nature to play the violin. We have to allow ourselves to be played by nature, because that's what violins do. But instead, the violin thinks its life is about itself, and that's like putting a chewing gum on the chords, and then everything becomes dissonant.
Starting with the small things, the things that I've heard you say and I've found myself repeating or thinking over in my mind. Let's start with some of these, please, Bernardo. The first one is this. I've heard you say that life is not about happiness or the pursuit of happiness. Life is about service. Now, please correct me if I'm describing this wrong, but I think this is a very profoundly simple idea. Could you perhaps speak on this, Bernardo?
It is as simple as it is obvious, I think. I have this thought experiment every spring around this time. My apple tree over there outside blossoms. So it gets covered in this little white, yellowish apple blossoms. And sometimes I imagine an apple blossom thinking that its life is about it, and that it will try not to die, and that it will try to be happy itself, regardless of the rest of the tree and the rest of the world. Well, if the apple blossom succeeded, there would be no more apple trees, because the apple blossom needs to wither and die to make space for an apple with the seeds that will create the next apple tree, and so on. So it's obvious that it's not about the apple blossom. It's not even about the apple tree. It's not even about apple trees in general. It's about nature. We and the apple blossoms, we are both things that nature does for a while in a grander scheme of things that if we are wise enough, we should recognize is not quite fathomable for the cognitive system of a monkey that has been around for max 300,000 years, with an intellect for about 30 to 50,000 years, which is the blink of an eye ago. Yeah. But we somehow have made this bizarre cultural convention in Western culture, which now sort of spreads around the world, that our lives are about us. My life's about me, your life's about you. This is a recipe for disaster, because for one, we cannot even begin to control even a small little set of the relevant variables that are of significance if it comes to our supposed happiness. In other words, it's completely out of control. It's largely determined by circumstances and dynamics that go way above our heads. And two, it makes us miss the point. The life of the apple blossom is service to the grand scheme of apple trees and to the grand scheme of nature beyond that. So is ours. The fact that we can't quite understand what that is, how it works, what are the causal chains and where are they leading, doesn't change the fact that that's what it is. We are products of nature. We are part of nature doing something. We don't quite exactly know what. And that's what life's about, service to nature. And that's obvious, the burden of argument in those who say that my life's about me and your life's about you. Why would it be? We are not isolated from nature. We are part of nature, part of an enormous dynamics of causal chains. So they have to argue against the in-your-face absurdity of their point. What I'm saying is the default position is what you're left with if you don't quite believe the other alternatives, because they are precarious.
We have an apple blossom. Its goal is rather obvious, and perhaps with a cicada as well. With us, is it a little bit more difficult? Is that why we've gone into a delusion of happiness or being about us? Because an apple blossoms. With us, is it a little bit more difficult to ascertain what we're meant to do? Is that why we become confused between happiness and service? Or?
I think we think the apple blossom's fate and purpose is simple because it fits with the scheme we see in nature. and we look at this scheme from above while the apple blossom is within it. So we think we can make sense of the purpose of the apple blossom. But insofar as we cannot extract ourselves from nature and look at nature from the outside,
mm,
then both our role in the grand scheme of things and the apple blossom's role is not quite clear. It's just that
mm,
we are in the throes of a Promethean complex for the past 400 years or so because of the success of technology, which we mistake for the tremendous success of science for figuring out what is. Well, science doesn't figure out what is. Science figures out how it behaves, how nature behaves, what
mm,
nature will do next, regardless of what it might or might not be. Um, but since the technological success of the past couple of hundred years, we have this Promethean attitude that we figured it all out. And that is not only supremely arrogant, it's almost an insane delusion, because why would the cognitive system of a primate who has been walking around for a very short time, sporting an intellect for even shorter,
mm,
would have the capability sort of to model and figure out everything that is salient about nature when it comes to these monkeys' purpose? Of course, we aren't capable. We
mm,
have our models. They are precarious, partial models with some practical utility, such as creating toys and cell phones, the internet, and maybe sending some people up to space.
mm,
So it's useful, but to mistake usefulness for true knowledge is 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 uh, is naive to some extent. So to find what our own purpose in the grand scheme of thing is probably impossible, because we are immersed in that grand scheme.
mm,
So we can't contemplate it from the outside, from above, with perspective and overview. And the same applies for the role of the apple blossom. It's just that because we know that the apple blossom is part of, the production of the next seed and the next apple tree, we think
mm,
we figured it all out. Or maybe we figured just a small part of it. And we don't really know what the whole thing is about.
mm. What happened 400 years ago, Bernardo? Was there a specific invention? Was it a long course of events that we sort of adopted this usefulness, you said it was, but not necessarily uh, the path to wisdom? What was that for you?
Well, in the beginning, in early science, with Descartes' dream about the key to
Mm,
nature being measurement and number,
mm,
which was true, and Galileo dropping the two balls from the top of the Tower of Pisa. In the beginning, there was healthy understanding that what we were doing was modeling, measurement, number, and predicting behavior. Galileo dropping the balls from the Tower of Pisa, and we were not um, naive enough to mistake modeling and behavior for a sort of ontological, metaphysical, grand understanding of what nature is. That came only much later. Early scientists were religious people,
mm,
and science for them was not contradictory with religion at all. It wasn't for Newton, who was a practicing alchemist, so
mm,
not quite a religion, but something very metaphysical in nature.
mm,
It was only after the half of the 19th century, because of cultural and psychosocial dynamics that, in hindsight, are very easy to understand, that the bourgeois elite that made up science at the time, if you look at Darwin, he was bourgeois. Even Goethe, who was ennobled, started as a bourgeois, the son of a very successful financially independent lawyer in Frankfurt. Um, Not only was their ambition now to survive the church, which was the ambition of early scientists. They didn't want to be burned at the stake like Bruno. But now, in the second half of the 19th century, the ambition was to supplant science in social significance and social status. In other words, to control the culture,
mm,
to supplant the clergy in controlling the culture. Nietzsche wrote about it as it was happening. Now, Nietzsche's corpus is a fantastic sort of journaling of the psychosocial dynamics as it was unfolding. And he understood the implications. The rest of his peers didn't. He did. And by the early 20th century, we were already, in the grip of the absurdities and incredible naivete and arrogance of logical positivism. Soon after, in the throes of behaviorism, there is no mind, there is only behavior. Mind is behavior. It's like, what? How ridiculous can one be? And then into eliminativism and illusionism, the denial of the very existence of consciousness, which is the only undeniable thing ever in the history of nature.
Mm.
And that had to do with social status, control of cultural narratives, power. It's a very male oriented thing. And it took until very late in the 20th century, and the turn to the century where we are now, for consciousness to return to healthy academic debate, for there to be a true, serious openness to views of nature that aren't physicalist, because physicalist was a way to supplant the clergy. Before physicalism, there was mind and there was matter. But for as long as the church controlled the mind, the church controlled everything that mattered. Forgive my pun.
Yeah, it's good.
And by denying mind altogether and saying that it's all matter, you wrestle complete social and cultural control from the church. That was the motivation, the psychological motivation. And that's changing only now. So yes, we are witnessing the ebb and flow of cultural psychology and cultural history. It to us as ephemeral human beings who are like mayflies, it looks like the beginning of science 400 years ago, was a long time ago. From the perspective of cultural history, it was last week. It's recent. And we are deep now into the next major transition.
Next time you say that pun, I'm going to say, I don't mind, puns matter. That's the spirit d'escalier. I was too late on it. What did Nietzsche see, Bernardo? Obviously, I can't get you to explain all of Nietzsche, but you said that he, unlike his peers, was deeply aware that culture was changing. It was being in the grips of a bourgeoisie that had wrested it away from the clergy. Can you perhaps briefly summarize what Nietzsche was pointing to or saying?
Yeah. We are meaning-seeking animals. We need meaning to survive. That's how Jews in concentration camps managed to survive. Because although the Nazis could take everything else from them, they couldn't take their perception of meaning in their lives. That meaning historically has always been anchored in something transcendent in our history as a species. Meaning is immanent in the world. It means it permeates everything, but it comes from outside the perceivable world. You can destroy anything you want in the perceivable world, meaning is still there, and it will still be immanent in whatever part of the world is left after your fit of destruction. That is a very old idea. God is both transcendent and immanent. I'm using the word God as a cultural concession. Normally, I am cautious about it because I don't know what people mean by the word God or what people will understand by this. But some transcendent mind is immanent in everything that we call physical. That's the idea. And the meaning of our lives is anchored in it. And because it is transcendent, it's immune to our narratives. We cannot tell ourselves that life is nihilistic and serves no purpose because we know that we don't know. Meaning is transcendent. So our narratives cannot corral it into a corner and make it disappear. It escapes all conceptual attempts to limit and bind it. So that has always been the case. So we have always had meaning, but the same move that was meant to supplant the clergy in terms of cultural hegemony had a side effect, which was to destroy the transcendent source of meaning, because the move was mind, which is the only thing that can be immanent in matter. Our minds is immanent in the matter of our brains and nervous system. And the idea was for the same reason, because the rest of the world is made of the same kinds of atoms and fields as our brain, So that transcendent mind, the mind of God, if you will, is immanent in the whole of nature. That was the perspective that we always had. But when we say mind doesn't exist, it arises from ephemeral constructs in matter, ephemeral organizations of matter, like brains. And if brains are destroyed, then mind is no longer immanent. Mind is not there at all anymore. That move, which did supplant the clergy culturally, came with the price of destroying the source of transcendent meaning. And then psychologically, what humans do when they lose a source of meaning is what's technically called fluid compensation. You will almost unconsciously transfer your need for meaning to another source. And other more precarious sources of meaning can be um, um, self image. When you have a very positive self image, you think you're better than everybody else. This gives you a precarious source of meaning. Closure is another one. For instance, if a family lost a son at war abroad, everything possible is done to bring the body back and give him or her a burial. That's closure. It wrestles meaning out of the seeming insanity of life. There are other sources of meaning, and that happened. So the new cultural elite, scientific, technological, commercial, bourgeoisie elite of the 19th century, started undergoing fluid compensation and adopting other sources of meaning, like surviving a project that's bigger than yourself. And you see that in the cultural elites of today. In terms of self-image, they think they are better than the populace, than the average uneducated person on the street. In the US, this has led to an enormous cultural schism, because the people who are less educated feel that their value, their integrity, their dignity is being dragged through the mud by the urban cultural elites, which it is. Of course, the reaction is very misguided. It's a terrible reaction to that, almost suicidal, but the grievance is real. And you see scientists deriving meaning from the fact that they are better than others, or at least they perceive themselves as so, deriving meaning from closure, because even if you can't win out, even if you can't live forever, you know nature is going to kill you eventually because you're part of nature and that's what nature does. You get one up on nature by figuring out what it's doing. You see? And you survive a project that is bigger than you. Your scientific theories may survive you. So in a sense, you keep on living in the form of your own theories that are left behind, even if they are proven wrong. It has been fluid compensation. But none of these alternative sources of meaning really replaces transcendent meaning, which is what has couched human existence forever, since the very beginning of the genus Homo. For all you know, even before modern humans, there is evidence for ancient symbolic burials in the genus Homo before modern humans. Homo neanderthalensis, for instance. Even, we are not quite sure, yes, but perhaps Homo naledi, which is much older still. And so that's the price we paid for that cultural hegemony of the urban educated bourgeoisie. We pay this price to this day, even though we are returning slowly to the authentic, original, primordial sources of meaning.
I believe it was Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning who said that if man has a why, he can survive any how.
Yeah, let me return to that because I didn't quite answer your question about Nietzsche and Viktor Frankl.
Yeah.
So Frankl, he realized that the will to meaning was stronger than Nietzsche's will to power. Nietzsche at some point concluded that the meaning of life was to acquire and accumulate power. And that has to do with meaning compensation as well. You get one up on nature. You know, you become the Ubermensch, the Superman. Maybe you can even find a way to live forever. That ethos is in the science today. We are trying to figure out ways to never die and get complete control over nature. It's an ethos that has been all along with us for the past 150, 200 years. And even the will to meaning is even stronger than Freud's will to pleasure, will to sexual gratification. Nietzsche came much earlier than Viktor Frankl, several decades earlier. What he realized is that because we lost that source of meaning in the form of transcendence, luminosity, transcendent divinity, no alternative sort that we would find through fluid compensation would actually compensate for that loss. That loss was, according to Nietzsche, a unique and momentous turning point in the history of humanity. It was the death of God. That's the in a part of the gay science, which these days, with the new meanings we attribute to words, should be better called the joyful wisdom. Because the word Wissenschaft in German translates as wisdom as well, not science in the sense that we attribute to the English word science. There's a passage in the gay science which he repeated in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in which Zarathustra, who is the prophet of the Superman, he announces the coming of the Superman. He descends from his mountain to the village and he announces to everybody that God is dead and that we killed God and that we have God's blood in our hands. And what he was announcing is we lost our source of meaning and we did it ourselves. And this will change everything. This will change everything, not only morals, it will change everything about the way we live, how we relate to the world, to each other, to other species. It will change everything. And nobody listened to Zarathustra. And Zarathustra then had to realize that this fundamental turning point in human history, despite being one of the most important things that has ever happened, went over the heads of his contemporaries. Nobody saw it happening. They would feel the effects, and the effects would be devastating. He saw all of this around 1880, maybe 1882, 83, around that time, 140, 150 years ago. And he wrote about it. And nobody listened. Towards the end of his sane life, he lived the last 10 years of his life completely mad and incoherent. But towards the end of his sane life, when he was writing his weird autobiography, Ecce Homo, he wrote, I know the names of all the 200 people who have ever read any one of my books because I gave them the book myself. He was bitter. Nobody understood or read him until decades later in the 20th century. And now we read him and we look back and we know he was right. Everything he predicted, not only the need for the Übermensch, the Superman who would overcome the need for meaning. A completely inhuman thing, but that's what he thought was necessary. The Übermensch was not a new species, but it was almost so. If you read the tone with which Nietzsche writes, he never really describes the Übermensch, but the tone with which he speaks of the Übermensch, it is clear that although it's not a new biological species, it's an entirely new kind of human that no longer needs to have meaning in order to survive and be content, which is a superhuman feat, and he knew it. He knew that because he had a tremendously religious disposition himself, even though he became an atheist. And this Übermensch, instead of the will to meaning, he would have the will to power. So through brute force, he would circumvent our need to have meaning. The Übermensch never came, but Nietzsche predicted that too. He predicted that if we wouldn't succeed in transforming ourselves into the Superman, the superhuman, we would end up as the last man or the last humans. And we did, because the last humans in Nietzsche's description is a creature that seeks no challenge, wants to live in safety and comfort, and distract themselves to oblivion. That's us watching television, social media, not avoiding risks as much as possible in life, only want comfort and safety. That's us. That's the last man. The last man does not overcome the need for meaning, and therefore is not the Superman, and therefore finds the next best thing, which is to merely distract him or herself during life until its inevitable oblivion. You just mind numb yourself as much as you can, and while being comfortable and avoiding challenges and avoiding surpassing yourself, avoiding a meaningful life as opposed to a mediocre life. All of this came to pass.
And we will get to this idea of service. I always previously understood Nietzsche's God is dead and we have killed him as the loss of a universal truth, but to hear it phrased as the loss of meaning is very, very interesting to me. Is it possible that someone will write or has already written God is reborn? And when we use this God, we're using meaning as that rather than sort of the figure in the sky and the anthropomorphized. But that God is dead is stuck in our culture. It's there. And even if people haven't read Nietzsche, they kind of know that. Is someone writing, or have they written God is reborn, God is alive, God 2.0?
Of course. Of course, it started happening in the 1960s. You see, the word God is tricky because one never knows what one means by it.
Yeah.
And that means that whatever one does mean by it can be meant by another word, which is exactly what we did in the age of the spiritual but not religious people, which is what statistics show we are in the majority. Spiritual but not religious. What we mean by this is that we reject one particular model or image of God, the bearded man sitting up in a cloud with a plan for everybody, which can only be a sadist, right? Because if our endless suffering is part of a plan, that's a very sadistic plan. If God knows what he's doing, this is a sadistic plan. Look at Ukraine right now, or Palestine and Israel. That image is gone. A new image of God has emerged, which is a much less committal image. It's an image based on a kind of sense of smell. We smell divinity now, but we don't quite dare to say what it is. We don't quite pin it down. It sort of escapes from under your finger like a little drop of mercury, if you know what I mean. But we sense it's there. We also sense we can't quite define it, but we sense it's there. It's immanent in nature. It's not up in a cloud. It's immanent everywhere, in everything. This is a sense, like a smell, like a primordial intuition that doesn't arise from conceptual reasoning, but which seems to be rooted at the very depth of the human mind forever. Even before we started thinking symbolically or conceptually 50,000 years ago. So God has been back for 80 years. And it has been back in myriad forms, even forms that are entirely based on reason and evidence. Because if you pursue reason and evidence all the way, fully committed to all their implications, you have to admit that there is something very weird about nature. You see that in things like the exquisite fine-tuning of the universal constants for the emergence of complexity in life. Universal constants are things that characterize the universe and which have no reason to be what they are. There are no constraints on what they could be. They could have been anything, but they are what they are, and they need to be what they are many, many points after the decimal, many, many positions after the decimal point. Sometimes dozens and dozens of positions. Otherwise, there wouldn't be complexity. There wouldn't be life. The universe would have remained uniform, bland, and structureless. So that's one of the confounding things. I don't want to overdo what I'm about to say because the New Age has way oversold it and therefore invalidated the argument. But if not for that, there would be an argument that quantum theory and quantum practice, quantum experimentation, has shown things that completely negate some of our some of the assumptions we make which deny meaning to nature. For instance, physical realism, the idea that physical things exist, have standalone existence, that they exist by themselves, regardless of whether they are being measured or observed or not, that is down the drain. To save this, you need to entertain some completely arbitrary and vastly inflationary theoretical fantasies for which there is precisely zero empirical evidence and which fly in the face of Occam's razor. So God is returning everywhere, but it doesn't go by the name God now. And that's why we think God is still dead.
And maybe if it doesn't have a universal name, it doesn't have that. That's what it was before. We all had something that we clung to. Can I bring you to service now? Because we've traced through this, and it's something that what does this look like? Rather than pursuing happiness, what does the pursuit of or the service look like? And does this idea resonate with people around you? I think when you get to maybe similar to our age, we see the beauty in it. But for young people, perhaps, who need it most, those in their late teens, early 20s, 30s, that have grown up in this, what does service look like? Can you describe it? Does it resonate with other people?
The statement has two parts. The first part is, why would your life be about you? That first part resonates with everybody, because when people give it the first thought, they go like, yeah, why should it? Right? I believe it is, but I believe it because I never gave it a thought. And the moment you ask the question, people give it a thought. It doesn't need to be a very deep thought. And they immediately realize, wow, yeah, why should it? I'm part of nature just like everything else. Why would this part of nature be about itself and not the whole of nature? So that resonates. The second part, which is, therefore, your life's about service, that's more difficult, especially for younger people. And it may not be a bad thing that it's more difficult for them. And I will now refer to Jung to help me make an argument for this. Jung, who was probably the greatest psychologist who ever existed, he realized that life has two parts too. There is the first half of life and the second half of life. Now the second half of life is much bigger than half because we live for so long. But human beings would live about 50, right? And the first half of life was 25 and the second was after that. Now we speak of the second half of life after 35, 40. But the first half of life is about carving a space in the world for you. In other words, translating into practical terms, having a source of income, acquiring respect from your peers, be someone who others listen to, at least somewhat, having the means to live and have a family, have a house, have a salary, food on your plate, a roof over your head, and be respected enough amongst your peers that you can say things that others will listen to. That's the first half of life. And that is about you. But it's also part of service, because for you to be of service, you have already to have carved the space in the world for you. You have to have means at your disposal, a minimal amount of means to be of service. Otherwise, all you have to do is figure out where your next plate of food is going to come from, and you will have time for nothing else. You cannot be of service if you have to spend all of your time trying to survive. And therefore, the first half of life looks like it is indeed about you. It is not. It's about service, but it's the part of the service in which you're acquiring the tools you need to do the job of service. And in acquiring the tools, you have to look after yourself. And our culture endorses the very first part of life. And extrapolates. It says it's your entire life that is about that, collecting the tools, making money, acquiring social status, having a house, having a wife, all of this, having kids. We think it's the whole of life is about this, but it's not. It's the first part of life. It's the preparation for service. For young people, it's okay that they forget that ultimately it's about service, because they will still do what they need to do in order to serve, which is to focus on themselves first. The second half of life is very different. And that's why we go through a midlife crisis. because the culture gives us a recipe to live the first half of life. Then circumstances change, and we no longer have the other recipe we need to live the second half of life. And we become depressed because the initial recipe no longer works. Once you have a house or two, a car or two, and your second trophy wife, and enough money in the bank, say 1 million in the bank, I'm exaggerating here to make my point clear. Um, the second million is now meaningless. The third house is meaningless. The third car is meaningless. Everything starts becoming meaningless. More status. Now, some teenage adults, some child men, and many of them are in the media, they keep on playing that adolescent game of more power, more money, more trophy wives, forever into their 80s. And they do that. It's an act of desperation. They do that because they do not know what else to do. The alternative is to roll up in a fetal position in a corner and wait to die, which nobody does. The second half of life, that's where we get screwed because the culture doesn't help us. The culture doesn't give us guidelines or a recipe, some orientation. The second half of life is about service. And that our culture does not endorse because our culture thinks our lives are about us. And based on that assumption, we cannot go anywhere else. You're screwed. You are going to have a meaningless, mediocre, nihilistic life based on the accumulation of power for no reason. That's Nietzsche's will to power. But if transcendence is back, now the second half of life is service. It's about allowing nature to do through you what nature wants to do. And to do that, you do not need to understand what nature is trying to do. And it's very important because if we demand from the apple blossom that it understands the large scheme of apple trees, then the apple blossom will never serve. If it needs to understand its service, it will never serve. Same applies to us. If you think you need to understand what nature is trying to do through you in order to allow yourself to be a tool of nature, then you will not. And you will continue to try to accumulate more money and more power, social media status, whatever it is, and never get satisfied, never get to the meaning that you so much crave, even though you don't know that you crave for meaning. We do not need to understand. All we need to do, and now it gets much more complicated, is to listen to a very deep intuition that better people than me have called by various names. Calling is one. James Hillman, the renowned psychologist who died in 2011, he called it soul, which is arguably a bad name because it has so many other connotations. Others call fate, lot, destiny. My best friend, who is the founder of Essentia Foundation, which I'm the director of, his name is Fred Matzer. He says, the point of life is the following. We are each a violin, and we have to allow nature to play the violin. In other words, and that's his key statement. We have to allow ourselves to be played by nature, because that's what violins do. But instead, the violin thinks its life is about itself, and that's like putting a chewing gum on the chords, and then everything becomes dissonant. And that's Fred's metaphor, not mine. But it's sort of bullseye hit on our dilemma. And how to learn to live in the service of nature is not something I don't have the 7 steps to learning how to live out your faith. I think I learned part of it myself, enough to inform my life, but I can't distill that into a little recipe, the 7 steps to I can't do that.
I think something like that comes through experience, it comes through time, and it comes through perhaps a willingness or a moment, a realization. Um, it's a
Mm.
lovely expression from your friend. We are violins and we should be played, not play ourselves. Because when
Allow ourselves to be played, yeah.
allow ourselves to be played, because violins can shriek and screech and they can sound awful.
But what you just said, how we learn to do that, I think you're right. Life teaches.
Mm.
The problem is that we no longer pay attention to life. All we pay attention to is our posts on social media and the next distraction, the next addictive compulsion, whether it's eating meat or watching porn, and the next thing that sort of takes our attention away from the realization that we are starving for meaning and that our life is mediocre and narcissistic and meaningless. But if we were to just open our minds and pay attention to life, life teaches through suffering.
Yeah.
So it's a hard lesson, but it's very valuable. You will suffer anyway, whether you take the lesson from it or not. So you might as well take the lesson. Life teaches how to do that. It taught me, at least partially. I'm in the early stages still, but I have learned a thing or two. So instead of trying to read the book called The 7 Steps to Living Your Destiny, allow life to teach you that by paying attention. That's what we miss. We don't pay attention. We have to pay attention. We don't need a guru from the Himalayas. What we need is to pay attention to the guru that is here, which is life, the world around us, the circumstances of our existence. If we pay attention, we will get a lot more than we could even imagine.
It's very hard to pay attention these days with social media and the things around us. Everyone, a wonderful phrase that I heard, I think first from Mark Fisher, no one is bored, but everything is boring. We have constant stimulation, but no meaning. You've said elsewhere, Bernardo, that introspection is the path to knowledge. Now, I think this is just what you've been hinting at. And for somebody so focused on science and clear, precise arguments, introspection is the path to knowledge. Can you just perhaps try to explain what this means? Why is introspection the path?
Oh, there are 3 paths to knowledges, and I think introspection is the royal path to knowledge. The other 2 are reasoning, logical reasoning, the intellect, which is what the scholastics tried to do in a failed way, but they tried. And the third one is empirical evidence, empirical observation, which is the path to knowledge that characterizes Western science most. Reason also characterizes Western science, but not introspection at all. Introspection characterizes mostly Eastern wisdom, Eastern Wissenschaft, which is more than science. It's science, philosophy, and wisdom all brought together. Why do I think that introspection is a path to knowledge? Some cynical people who who are friends of mine. I'm joking, calling them cynical, but they say, "Well, Bernardo, the problem is the human psychology is such that the grass is always greener at the neighbors, and because I am not good at introspection, I'm good at reasoning and evidence because that's how I was educated. You know, when my first job was at CERN in Switzerland, the cathedral of science in the world." Because I am not good at introspection, then I think introspection is the royal path to knowledge. Because the grass is always greener at your neighbors. You always think that which you don't have is the most important thing. That's the cynical approach to my attitude. I don't believe that myself. I think now that I'm turning 50, I'm not so immature that I can't make that discernment, that distinction myself. I don't think I'd say what I say because I think what I don't have is best. I truly think that introspection is the royal path to knowledge for the following reason. And let's go back to Kant and Schopenhauer now, because they are the ones that expressed this. Kant said, we can't see the world as it is in itself. All we can see is how the world presents itself to our perception, an image of the world. To be the world, sorry, to know what the world is in and of itself, you need to be the world. But we aren't. We are looking at the world. So we can only see phenomena. In other words, representations. how the world presents itself to us, how the world appears. We can only know appearances. We cannot know essence. To know essence, you have to be the thing, and we are not, so we cannot know the essence of things, or the noumena, as Kant put it. Phenomena are the appearances we can know, but the noumena, the thing in itself, we cannot know. And Schopenhauer came around less than 4 decades later. Uh, yeah, less than 4 decades later. Kant was in 1780s. Schopenhauer was saying this in 1818. He said, Kant is largely right, but not completely right, because there is one set of noumena that we can know, irrespective of the phenomena. There is one thing we can know beyond appearances, and that is us. I know me beyond my appearance.
Yeah.
Even if I'm not looking in the mirror, I know what it is like to be me. I know my thoughts, I know my emotions, I know my will, which is the word Schopenhauer chose because it's an endogenous experience. It doesn't need awareness of the world for you to will. No, a baby, even if a baby doesn't see or or hear, the baby still wants, or the baby still thinks, the baby still has emotions. So for Schopenhauer, these are the noumena. These are the things in themselves. And we know them because we are us. Now, what is the appearance of what we are? What is the appearance of our thoughts, our emotions, our will? Well, it's the body. If I'm feeling sadness, the appearance of my sadness is my tears, and you can see my tears. But what forms my tears? What forms my body? Well, it's the same kinds of atoms and fields that form the rest of the universe. So the rest of the universe, too, is the appearance of inner will. Therefore, to know the universe, you have to introspect. Because by introspecting, you can know, you can become acquainted with the thing in itself insofar as you. And because your appearance is of the same type, physical atoms, fields, as all the rest of the universe, then in knowing you, you are knowing all the rest of the universe. So even Western philosophy over 200 years ago endorses the notion, if you know how to read it and extract the implications, even Western philosophy endorses the notion that introspection is the royal path to knowledge. And it just so happens that Bernardo Kastrup is not good at it.
There is this wonderful moment that you're already describing idealism, and I wanted to try to go through some of this knowledge that describing Schopenhauer, where you say if we know the thing inside us that gives rise to the physical manifestations, to the tears, to the body. I had the image of what does the universe's tears looks like. I love that. But if we know this thing inside us that gives rise to the physical manifestations, that is pointing to something beyond the physical manifestations of the world or the universe, saying that can we start with this one inside us, this will? What was Schopenhauer talking about here? Because soul, duty, calling, meaning, us, what is this thing in that sense, Bernardo?
Why did Schopenhauer choose this specific word, will, das Wille? It's because the will, our willing, our will is an eminently endogenous experience. It comes from the inside. It doesn't come from the outside. The will is that which eminently comes from the inside and not the outside. In other words, it doesn't require sense perception. You can will even if you're not seeing or hearing or tasting or smelling or touching. There are other experiences that are also eminently endogenous, and Schopenhauer meant them too as part of the will. Things like thoughts, which Schopenhauer said that appear to us in the form of abstract representations. I'm not going to get into these details, but every experience we have that is endogenous, in other words, every experience you could have if you were locked in a perfect sensory deprivation chamber,
Mm.
Everything you would experience under those circumstances are endogenous experiences. They come from within. They are self arising. They do not require the appearances of the world, the colors of the world, the scents, the tastes of the world to exist. You can think and feel without perceiving.
Mm.
That's why he chose that word. But he didn't mean, actually, he explicitly wrote that that's not what he thought. He didn't mean that the will is personal. The will is impersonal. It is our access to the will that is personal. Schopenhauer said, space and time are not an objective scaffolding of the world. Space and time are categories of perception. It's the way we organize data about the world.
Mm.
Now, the structure of our filing cabinet, cognitive filing cabinet in us, is space time. Space time is not out there. But space-time is what Schopenhauer called the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation.
Mm.
It's what allows us to make distinctions between different things. You are you and not me because you occupy a different volume of space at the same time, or the same volume of space at a different time.
Mm.
But if space-time is a category of perception, then it doesn't exist in the noumenal world. It doesn't exist in the world as it is in itself. Therefore, there are no distinctions between things. There is only oneness. And therefore, the personal will is, in fact, the cosmic will. It's the one will of the world. Or as Schopenhauer put it, it is the one eye of the world that looks out from every creature. So his argument was, through introspection, what we find is not only our individual noumena, but the noumena of all existence,
Mm.
which seems personal to us because it comes covered in layers of narrative making, ideas, concepts. But the true raw will does not have conceptual narratives. It's pure will. That's why the word will precedes conceptual narratives, conceptual thinking. Um, and that's what we are, the primordial, raw will. And that is not personal. Therefore, by introspecting, you get to know the impersonal universe, everything, not only your personal self. So the appeal to introspection is not an appeal or not an edification of the personal self. It is, in fact, the annihilation of the personal self if you introspect deeply enough.
Mm.
If you go inside yourself deeply enough, you cross a threshold in which there is no David anymore.
Mm.
There is no Bernardo anymore. There is no human anymore. There is only the universal, the noumena of the universe itself. So, contrary to appearances, that royal path to knowledge is not an edification of personhood or individuality.
You go beyond the culture, beyond the society to yourself, and you go through yourself. You use that as a conduit to then find the universal, which is time.
Exactly. Introspection goes through a funnel of personhood, but once it crosses the funnel on the other side, it opens up
Yeah.
in a limitless manner. It opens up to the entirety of existence. And that is how we can live a life of service. Because if you introspect deeply enough, the will you find is no longer your personal will. It is the will of nature as it expresses itself through you. And if you follow that impersonal will, which doesn't give a damn about your social standing, your status, even your health or your comfort, if you find that impersonal will deep within you, that being the will of nature, and if you follow it, now you're living a life of service. And this may sound very romantic, but I guarantee you there is nothing romantic about this. It's raw, difficult, um, and not compatible with contentment and comfort most of the time. But it is an explosion of meaning.
Mm. It's the idea of being in a chamber where all the sensories are gone and just that thing resonating inside, that will. Is this, could we go from this, Bernardo, to the idea of synchronicity then? because I've heard you talk about this quite a few times, and I've always loved these experiences when they happen, and I smile at them and I frown and I get scared and I become amazed. Synchronicity, is it a scientific term? Because I've never really heard about it like serendipity and like John Cusack movies or something. It sounds very whimsical or romantic, but is there something to the idea of synchronicity, Bernardo?
I think there is. I would not classify it as scientific today
Mm,
because it's not something that can be sufficiently studied according to the methodology of science. And I'll explain why.
mm,
So, in not calling it scientific, I'm not demeaning it. I'm just saying that it cannot be studied according to scientific methodologies. But I think there is something to it. Science is not a magical methodology that allows us to know everything that is salient. It doesn't. It allows us to know a very important subset of nature, but there are things about nature that completely escape the methodology of science. Now, what are synchronicities? Jung defined it as meaningful
mm,
coincidences. It can be a coincidence between an inner mental state and an outer configuration of the world, both which arise at the same time and evoke the same meaning. And according to Jung, this is not just chance.
mm,
Synchronicities are the expression of an organizing principle in nature that is orthogonal to causality. So, causality organizes the world. One thing causes another, which in turn causes yet another, and that's how the structure of the world or the configuration of the world is largely determined. But Jung and Pauli, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, known for the Pauli principle, who was Jung's patient at the time and developed synchronicity together with Jung. We have all the letters they exchanged during that process. Somebody published a book with them. It's somewhere here behind me. They thought that nature is organized not only by causality, cause and effect, but by some other organizing principle that was based on correspondences of meaning. So cause effect is one axis, and synchronicity is an orthogonal axis. And both organizing principles play a role in defining the configuration of nature. Do I think there is something to it? Yes. I even think, as Jung and Pauli themselves suggested in the final letters of their exchange, Pauli regrettably died. They themselves acknowledged that if their ideas were to be made fully coherent, and I'm not going to explain why, for the idea to be coherent, you need to bite this final bullet. I would need 10 minutes to explain. I can if you want, but it would require 10 minutes to go through that rationale in a lot of detail. But the conclusion was, for this idea to be coherent, then causality must be reducible to synchronicity. In other words, causality is not fundamental.
mm,
Even causality is a form of synchronicity, and nature organizes itself entirely by correspondences of meaning. It is a very large pill to swallow, but
mm,
Pauli did, and these were not small men, if you know what I mean.
yeah.
So if they could, then it's not a shame to entertain the possibility that this may be true, even if one doesn't quite agree with it. That is only tenable under an idealist framework, which Jung was. Jung was an idealist, even though he never said it. If you read through his corpus, he was. I wrote a book making this case. And then the idea here is that if the external world is also mental, just like we are mental, we are mind, we are psyche. If the external world too is psychic, and the physical stuff we see is the appearance of mental processes, just like my body is the appearance of my mental processes. My brain activity is the appearance of my mental processes. If the same applies to the world, because the world is made of the same atoms and fields as my brain, so the same applies to the world, and then the world too is mental. It's a series of transpersonal mental processes unfolding according to links of meaning, because that's how mind operates.
Mm,
Mind operates according to meaning evocations. isomorphisms of meaning, correspondences of meaning,
Mm.
then the world at large must be mental for it to be synchronistic, because meaning correspondences are something mind does, not inert matter. So this is an idealist framework, which I think is entirely coherent. It's actually the best framework we have to account for nature today. I have been making this case for 15 years, and now I am in very good company. In the beginning, I was not, but now I am in an extremely respectable company. Some big names out there are coming out now as idealists and biting this bullet as well. So yes, I think synchronistic is true because the world is mental. The world also operates according to correspondences of meaning, which appear to us largely as causality, but not only as causality. And because everything is one big mind, just a dissociated mind, I am dissociated from the rest of the mental activity of nature, but I am part of the same mind as nature. And that mind operates according to the same archetypes, the same templates of behavior, then it very much stands to reason that the events of the world, which follow certain templates, certain archetypal templates, will meaningfully coincide with my own mental activity, because my mind too unfolds according to the same archetypal templates. And the whole thing makes sense.
Can you perhaps give an example of synchronicity, or point to it? Because you explained it in relation to causality, how it might be the final function of causality. But what is it when we see it, or when we, because you said that for some instances there could be synchronicity between an inner state and an external state. What does it look like? How might someone recognize this? Where does it appear?
It looks like everything you have ever observed. Our inner mental activity and the unfolding of the external world, they go in lockstep because they are expressions of the same basic archetypal templates. It's just that sometimes the correspondence of meaning is so drastic, so in your face, that it sort of gets perceived with more contrast and rises above the background. But even the background is a series of correspondences of meaning. The world reflects us, we reflect the world. So what we call synchronicities are just instances in which this correspondence of meaning is gigantic. It's very much in our face. Now, we have to guard against the possibility now of allowing the ego with its little conceptual narratives to attribute meaning where it's not, or attribute the wrong kind of meaning. If you do that, you will become paranoid schizophrenic. You will see correspondences that aren't really there. You will be projecting your own ideation onto the world. So we have to guard against that, because this idea seems to give legitimacy to this compulsive paranoid ideation. And it's not meant to. It may be perceived as doing so, but it shouldn't, because paranoid ideation is something created by the ego, which is a very small complex in the human mind. And to take that above the rest of mind is not justified by this theory of synchronicity. So let's guard against perceiving illusory meaning where it's not, and letting our paranoid ideations go unchecked. That said, there are many correspondences of meaning that we can't grasp, because we are small little parts of nature. We don't have the overview that would be required to discern all these long arches of meaning correspondences. We do not have the cognitive capacity to even discern meaning, let alone their correspondences. We don't know what certain things mean. What does a black hole mean? What does a quasar or a supernova mean? You know, why would a monkey that has been running around a rock, sporting an intellect for 30,000 years only, know the meaning of a black hole or a quasar or an erupting volcano? So if we can't even figure that out, how are we to figure out all the correspondences of meaning that are there? But they are there, whether we figure them out or not. And the ones that we can figure out significantly does stand above the rest in our recognition. And we call them synchronicities.
Is there, you mentioned very frequently the idea that we're evolved apes, 30,000 years of intellect or consciousness, things like that. But then you also tie it in with this, there is a greater being. Now, sometimes in my uneducated mind, I see these two frameworks, worldviews as distinct or not compatible. One is full of meaning, the other is we've evolved apes that have lost our tail and we're just spinning on a rock. But you put those together with not a blink of the eye.
Of course, they're
Yeah.
not contradictory at all.
Mm,
You, like the rest of our culture, is just the victim of a cop out.
mm,
Um, Materialists or physicalists, materialism or physicalism not being a scientific view, it's a metaphysical view. It's a statement about what things are. Things are not conscious. Things are dead and inert. That's a metaphysical view, not a scientific one. A scientific view is things will do this next. That's science. It's
mhm,
predicting what nature will do next. It's a model of behavior, not of isness, not of being. Um, but this metaphysical physicalists, um, they successfully conveyed to the culture at large over the past 1.5 centuries this notion that science itself is physicalist, that physicalism is implied by scientific knowledge, that one thing comes hand in hand with another. This is a cop out. There is nothing intellectually valid about it. Let me put it in absolutely clear terms. It is a lie. And it is probably a deliberate lie. Um, Part of that whole dynamics that started halfway through the 19th century about succeeding in stealing cultural hegemony from the clergy. You know, we are still experiencing echoes of that. So there is absolutely no contradiction between an idealist view that says everything is mental, not my mind alone, not your mind alone. There are external states of the world out there, but those states too are mental. And physicality is just the appearance of those states. It's just how those states present themselves to our observation because we have the cognitive system we have. In other words, physicality is an interaction between our mental states and external states of the world. Both are mental. When they interact during an observation or measurement, they interfere with one another, and the result of that is perceived as colors, sounds, tastes, textures, and so on and so forth. So physicality is not fundamental. It's the appearance of mentality, of mental processes. This is entirely consistent with the theory of evolution, which is a scientific theory. And there is nothing materialist about that at all, other than some bozos who claim that one thing implies the other. They are just bozos. They just do not know what they are saying, or they are being malicious. I think there are examples of both. Um, Under idealism, nature is one mind. All processes in nature are mental. And why one mind? Because it solves all kinds of problems, avoids the combination problem, all kinds of technical things. So it's much easier and much more explanatorily powerful to say there is only one mind out there. Otherwise, we would have to explain how fundamentally distinct minds can interact with one another, how they can join and decombine. We avoid all that by saying there is one mind. Now, why do I seem to be separate from nature? Well, because mind can undergo a process we call dissociation. We know that from psychiatry. Human minds undergo dissociation. So if nature is a mind, it can undergo dissociation. And what is dissociation? It's inferential isolation in mental processes. Less technically, it's when one mind experiences itself as many because subsets of that mind cannot access other subsets. This happens with people as well. For instance, when you dream, you are dissociated. Your mind is doing both your dream avatar and the rest of the dream. But the mind of your dream avatar cannot access the mental processes that are constructing the rest of your dream. So you think, as an avatar, that the rest of your dream is external to you. But when you wake up, you realize it's one mind doing both. It was you all along. In exactly the same way, the mind of nature can be dissociated. And therefore, we think we are not doing the rest of nature. We think we are our dream avatars. Um, Evolution is the steady change of dissociated processes in the mind of nature that secure the continuance of dissociation. Because under idealism, living beings are just what a dissociative process in the mind of nature looks like. That's what metabolism is. It's what dissociation looks like when observed from the outside. Therefore, the first living being that ever arose on this planet was the first dissociation that could ever be perceived around our neighborhood here. And that dissociation, if it there may have been many of those dissociations, most of which died out. Most original living creatures died out until one arose that managed to survive and reproduce. And therefore, that is the one that survived and continued. And those dissociations that survived, if they found better ways to maintain their dissociative boundaries, to maintain their entropic isolation from the rest of the world, to remain coherent, the ones that were more capable of remaining coherent, maintaining the dissociative boundaries, are the ones who survived through fitness. And we are the result of that. We are supreme dissociative processes that are supremely capable of maintaining their dissociation despite the second law of thermodynamics. Eventually, we lose that battle. Eventually, the dissociation ends. In other words, we die. But you see, there is no incompatibility, no dichotomy here between science and an idealist metaphysics. The notion that science requires the physicalist or the materialist metaphysics is a cultural misunderstanding at best and a malicious cop-out at worst.
So we have evolved to disassociate, and this disassociation is an adaptation, a survival that we need.
No. We have evolved to maintain and reproduce the dissociation. We didn't evolve to dissociate because there is no living being before dissociation. There is just the universe at large. So you have to have a seed that starts the evolutionary process. That seed is the first dissociation or the first dissociations. And amongst those, the ones that could maintain their dissociation longer and reproduce, they are the ones that we see around still today. Of course, it couldn't have been any different. So we are dissociative processes that have evolved to remain dissociated and to spin off more dissociative processes like us, because that's what evolution would do, inevitably. It doesn't require any grand plan, any premeditated strategy from a self-reflective deity, which I think that doesn't exist. I don't think what we call God is self-reflective and deliberate and has a plan and is self-aware. No, I think what we call God is a mind, but it's an instinctive mind. Higher level mental functions arose out of the evolutionary process. We evolved higher level mental functions because of environmental constraints, the need to react to environmental challenges and opportunities. Because of those, we evolved this higher level cognitive abilities. In other words, God doesn't know what he's doing. We may know even better, which is a very Jungian thing to say because Jung arrived at the same conclusion.
I have two thoughts in my head. One is about the first seeds sprouting and disassociation beginning from the one that was able to reproduce. And that's such a powerful thing that I keep thinking about it. And the other one is that we maintain the disassociation in order to continue. If we change the environment around us, then we would need different things to continue. I'm wondering about going back to the seeds. Now, we can't go back to the seeds in our present state because we need the disassociation to continue. Do we ever return? Do we ever, because it's all changed to the environment. I feel like I'm asking a stupid question, please.
No, no. Uh, I don't think we return. That's not how evolution works. But
Mm,
could there be new seeds popping out elsewhere or even on Earth? Yes. Actually, there may have been multiple seeds that popped out and led to parallel evolutionary trees on Earth, which are still around, but we haven't detected yet. Because to detect, we have to do sort of a biochemical analysis down to the molecular level. And we haven't done that for the vast majority of living creatures out there. So it is conceivable that there are living creatures out there who are part of an entirely parallel tree of evolution and do not share a common ancestor with us at all, nowhere. And that may be still happening today. There may be new events of abiogenesis, the rise of life from non-life, happening today on planet Earth and in other places in the universe. So we don't need to return because, for all we know, nature is still starting things off from the beginning in parallel with our evolutionary tree.
mm.
Um, Look, you said we maintain our dissociation because we want to. Yes, that's true. But we want to maintain our dissociation because there was a fitness advantage to these dissociative mechanisms wanting to maintain their dissociation. The ones who don't want to maintain their dissociation go extinct. It's only the ones who really, really, really want to maintain their dissociation. In other words, who really, really want to remain alive, that survive and
Yeah.
reproduce.
Mm.
So even the personal expression of the will is a product of evolution. What is not is the primordial will, that which you find when you introspect so darn deeply that even individuality disappears. And now you're at the ground level of the raw will of nature, which is what nature is. Nature is the raw will.
That is where we got, and I was with you so much when we were talking about Kant and Schopenhauer, the phenomena, the noumena, that deep inside Schopenhauer said, we have this thing that we know. Is that the same with the world? The world is physical, it's colors, it smells, there are trees, there are mountains, there are people from the municipal office messing with your trees. But that is it's a shadow for something deeper,
It's an appearance.
an appearance.
Yeah, it's an
Yeah.
appearance. So, yes, the same applies to the world.
Uh,
The raw primordial will in us is the raw primordial will behind the world, behind the appearances. It is the thing that appears in the form of physicality.
mm,
Actually, in science today, if you look at the work of Alberto Feletti and Franco Vasa, one is an astronomer, the other one is a neuroscientist. They show that if you look at the structure, the large structure of the universe, the universe as it is at its largest possible scales,
mm,
which we can model today. We can run these models that show us the structure of the distribution of matter across the universe at its largest scales, at the scale of many, many, many super galaxy clusters.
mm,
Um, it looks like the organization of a mammalian brain. And not only in appearance, but in network topology as well. We can study, we
mm,
can do a spatial Fourier transform. I don't know whether we want to get into all these details, but there are objective ways to analyze the network structure of the universe and mammalian brains
mm,
without entailing the subjective recognition of correspondences. It's not about looking at pictures that look the same. It's about applying methodologies driven by numbers and getting a quantified assessment of the similarity. They've done that.
mm,
And that quantified assessment of similarity shows that it's discombobulating similar. And we have no scientifically endorsed explanation for that today. Nothing in science tells us that the universe at its largest scales should look like a mammalian brain. Why should it? But it does. And why does it do under analytic idealism? Because they look, my inner experiences present themselves to you as the anatomy and patterns of brain activity of my brain. The same applies to the universe at large. The underlying mental processes that nature is present themselves to us as something that looks like a brain. Why wouldn't it? It's experience appearing as a brain in one case, and experience appearing as something like a brain in the other case. It's entirely reasonable. It's entirely expectable,
But
and it is true.
and when it gets hinted at, it just is there only one? I didn't frame this question correctly, but I'm imagining now that this is the consciousness of a very large being, that this is this everything that we know is the physical manifestation of some God nature's inner thing. Is there
Yeah.
another one that's talking to? I realize I've just asked you a question about multiverses, which is very stupid, but I'm just asking, is there more than one?
Um,
There can't be.
Look, I cannot give you a categorical answer to that because I
Yes.
am a monkey who has had an intellect for only 30,000 years. I can tell you that there are very good reasons to assume that it's only one,
Yeah.
because postulating that there are two leads to all kinds of inner contradictions and insoluble problems. So the idea that there might be two may be just a arbitrary random notion that arises in a human mind that is completely divorced from the regularities and the structure of nature. So we are in a much better position to account for what's happening and what is based on the notion that there is only one mind which dissociates. Because we know that happens. We know that one mind can dissociate and reassociate. It happens to people. And that avoids the problems you would have if you had to postulate that there are fundamentally distinct minds that then somehow interact. How they can interact? They are fundamentally distinct. They are different universes. How could they interact? That's the so-called interaction problem in philosophy. And the other problem is the combination problem. If you say, for instance, that one neuron in my brain has one mind and another neuron has another, why do I experience myself as a unitary mind and not the aggregation of multiple gazillions of neurons? Well, then you have to say, well, the minds of neurons, which are fundamentally separate, or the minds of elementary subatomic particles in my brain, which are fundamentally separate, somehow combine to form my unitary experience. And if you analyze this postulate carefully, you realize that it is insoluble. There is no coherent account, not even in principle, let alone in practice, for how this combination could take place. It is incoherent to postulate that. In other words, it's illogical. It makes no sense. It leads to contradictions, deeper contradictions in our line of thinking. So I take the position that it's only one mind because that's the only seemingly viable approach to take if we are to stick to reason and evidence.
You've just about in this 90 minutes, Bernardo, broken my brain. I think I've, I would love to keep throwing at you questions, but I think I need to sit and genuinely think about these for a little while. I'm going to give you one tried example to suggest where my mind is at the moment as I'm trying to understand it, because the Schopenhauer Kant thing made so much sense to me. And then picturing other things like that also, that's how I'm understanding it. I'm thinking of, I don't know why, that's why I said shadows, Plato and the shadows on the wall. And sometimes we mistake things for being the real thing, but they're not. They're hinting at something else. They're pointing to something else. You always say we mistake the map for the territory. We point at the moon, but we look at the finger. And it's about finding that perhaps in ourselves first, and then we see it elsewhere.
Well, I like to believe that we don't need to find it in ourselves first, because
Okay.
otherwise I would be screwed. Look,
Yeah.
I'm the first in line to recognize the limitations of the scientific method and the methodologies of analytic philosophy. In other words, rational thinking, careful, explicit, conceptually clear, rational thinking. I'm the first in line to recognize the limitations of these two approaches to knowledge and to recognize that the royal path is the path of introspection. Having said that, I think we can do a lot better with reason and evidence alone than we have been doing so far. What we have been doing so far is illogical and contradicts the evidence. We can do better than that. So I think we can still take many steps forward before we face the need to rely on introspection. Which doesn't mean that we shouldn't introspect. People who have been dealt by nature a different deck of cards than I have, I have skills in rational reasoning and empirical science, but I don't have skills, very much good skills in introspection. So I can't do that. But I still like to think that despite that limitation of mine, I can take steps forward. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Beautiful way of expressing it. Bernardo, I'm just going to bring this conversation here to a close. I'm going to ask you a couple of throwaway questions just because it amuses me. But I thank you for your time, and I do hope people go and watch some of the videos on the Essentia Foundation YouTube channel, because they're incredible. There is one on there where you talk about music. I believe it was you, music being the shadow, but what is it really pointing to? What is the source of music? And that blew my mind for a while. So thank you for this. Two throwaway questions before we go. Imagine you're playing Hikaru in chess. What move do you open with your white?
Definitely 1e4. Yeah.
Me too. That's exactly the same, the most boring answer. But I didn't say Magnus Carlsen because you can't play that. So I said Hikaru. It's nice to know
that D4 defined the tournament. Yeah, I think Hikaru probably is regretting that right now. But it was a good try. I understand him.
It's nice to find another chess fan. Bernardo, a book, a movie, a song. Do any come to mind? Yes.
A movie, definitely La Double Vie de Véronique by Krzysztof Kieślowski, a Polish filmmaker. Changed my mind. It changed my life in 1991. It made me feel that the primordial urge towards completion in an artistic way that goes way beyond any conceptual reasoning. It takes us much further than conceptual reasoning. The name in English, I don't know, but I will translate it. The Double Life of Veronica. A wonderful movie by Kieślowski. A song, I'll mention a song that did the same thing for me as the movie did. And that is song to the song to the Siren, sung by Elizabeth Fraser in 1983, which evokes the same feeling, the urge towards primordial completion, the urge towards the beloved, the transcendent beloved. So yeah, the song to the Siren, sung by Elizabeth Fraser. It's her version. Elizabeth Fraser from the Cocteau Twins.
Okay.
You're British, so that's right up your alley.
I believe a guitarist, John Frusciante, did a song by the same name, so that's where. But I'll check that out. That's a movie.
By the way, her version came out not under the Cocteau Twins, but This Immortal Coil, which was a sort of a loose collaboration between different musicians in the early 80s. So the This Mortal Coil version of Song to the Siren by Elizabeth Fraser, it brought me to tears first time I listened to that.
Brilliant. Last one is a book, Bernardo.
That's a tough one because there are so many wonderful books, but I will go with Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation.
I've never read it, and now I need to. It's a big readable one, isn't it? Yeah. Okay.
It's very big, but it's very easy to read. Schopenhauer was the antithesis of Hegel. He writes as if he were standing in front of you, telling you a story.
That's
and
lovely.
He repeats himself a lot. So if you didn't understand a passage, you don't need to go back. Keep on reading. He will come back to that from another angle, in another context. You cannot not understand the man. Only academics are stupid enough to not understand the man, because they what's that English expression? They split hairs, and they fail to understand that Schopenhauer is talking colloquially, and therefore the meaning he attributes to certain words change with context. But academics are too anal retentive. and uptight and hair splitting that they don't understand it, because they think if he uses the word will here in this sense, then it's the same sense elsewhere. Therefore, he's contradicting himself. Only academics are stupid enough to not see what Schopenhauer is saying.
What was his personality like? Do you have any? Because he looks like a grumpy old man whenever I see these images of him with his high bald forehead and yeah.
No, philosophers are only philosophers after they die, because death filters out their horrible character flaws. So
Yeah.
even Bernardo Kastrup will only be Bernardo Kastrup after I'm dead. So the dying is the final act that crowns a philosopher's career. And one has to die well as a philosopher, and probably as anything else, as any person. Dying is the crowning of life. It's the indispensable final crowning achievement. So Schopenhauer is the sage that we regard him today as. Today, he's the philosopher that pointed the way. He's the philosopher that brought East and Western traditions together.
Mm.
The man is a giant. Why? Because he's dead. Because when he was alive, he was a supremely arrogant
Yeah.
man, a misogynist, somebody who hated his own mother, even though I understand that because his mother also hated him and kicked him out of the house after his father died. But not an easy character, a very, very flawed man who died as he lived, alone.
Mm. Bernardo, today, thank you for making me be aware of the apple blossoms. That's how I would like to
I'm
finish.
delighted that you said that.
Yeah.
You got it, sir. Most people don't. It is all about the apple blossom.
Yeah.